There's a couple I want you to meet. I'm going to call them David and Linda. They're not famous. They didn't make any bold moves. They didn't start a business, flip houses, or catch a lucky stock. They just did everything right. For 32 years, they did exactly what every financial expert, every personal finance book, every well-meaning colleague ever told them to do. And at 64, they retired. And for about 18 months, life felt like the reward they always imagined. And then, quietly, almost invisibly, things started going wrong. Not because they were careless, not because they made some dramatic mistake, but because they did what most people do when they finally reach the finish line. They stopped thinking about the race. This story isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to make you feel something deeper than fear. It's meant to make you feel prepared. Because the mistakes David and Linda made aren't rare. They're actually the most common mistakes that disciplined, well-intentioned people make. And they're almost impossible to see coming unless someone shows you what to look for. So let's start at the beginning. David was an engineer. Linda worked in hospital administration. They met in their late 20s, got married, bought a modest house. And from the very start, they had a deal. They would live below their means. Not dramatically below. They still went on vacation, still helped their kids with college, still enjoyed weekends. But they were consistent. Quietly, relentlessly consistent. Every month, a portion of each paycheck went into their 401(k)s. They increased contributions every time they got a raise. They didn't touch the accounts during market crashes, not in 2001, not in 2008, not even when their friends were panic selling. They diversified. They rebalanced. They took the boring advice seriously. By the time they retired, they had just under $1.4 million between their two accounts. Not crazy wealthy, but genuinely, meaningfully comfortable. Enough. Their house was paid off. Their kids were independent. They had Social Security coming in a few years. For the first time in over 3 decades, they could breathe. And they did. They breathed. They traveled. They cooked dinner together without rushing. Linda started painting again. David picked up woodworking. For about a year and a half, retirement was everything they had worked for. Now here's the thing. From the outside, nothing looked wrong yet. Their portfolio was actually growing those first 2 years. Markets were performing well. They were withdrawing money, sure, but the numbers kept going up. They felt confident, maybe even a little smug, in the best possible way. They were pulling out about $56,000 a year to cover living expenses, roughly 4% of their portfolio. You might recognize that number. The 4% rule is one of the most well-known guidelines in retirement planning. The general idea is that if you withdraw 4% of your portfolio annually, adjusted for inflation, your money should last about 30 years. David had read about this. He felt good about it. What he didn't fully understand, and this is where things start to crack, is that the 4% rule is a guideline built on average returns over long historical periods. It doesn't promise you anything about when those returns show up. That distinction, it matters more than almost anything else in retirement. But we'll get there. The first mistake happened almost immediately, and it was completely invisible at the time. Their retirement accounts, the 401(k)s they'd been building for decades, were traditional accounts. Pre-tax money, which means every dollar they pulled out would be taxed as ordinary income. This isn't uncommon. Most people in their generation saved in traditional accounts because that was the default. But it means that their $56,000 annual withdrawal wasn't really $56,000. After federal and state taxes, they were clearing closer to $44,000. To make up the gap, they pulled a bit more. A little more than 4%. Maybe 4.6%, 4.8% in some years. Still seemed fine. Then there was Social Security. They had decided to start claiming early, at 62, because hey, might as well start collecting, right? The money is there. Except claiming early reduced their monthly benefit permanently. They were getting roughly 30% less per month than if they had waited until 67 or even 70. Over 20-plus years, that's a number that quietly becomes enormous. And the third thing, and this one is the hardest to explain but probably the most important, the market turned. Not dramatically, not a crash, just 2 years of mediocre returns, followed by one genuinely bad year, right in the early part of their retirement. Here's what most people don't understand about retiring into a down market or even a flat market in those early years. When you're accumulating, when you're working and saving, down years are actually fine. You're buying shares at a discount. Time is on your side. But when you're withdrawing, when you're selling shares every month to pay for groceries and utilities, a down market hits differently because now you're selling low. You're locking in losses. And those shares you sold at a discount are gone. They can't recover for you. This is called sequence of returns risk. And it's one of the cruelest dynamics in personal finance because it has nothing to do with your discipline, your intelligence, or how long you saved. It's about timing. It's about which years you happen to retire into. David and Linda retired in what looked like a fine market environment. But 3 years in, things got bumpy. Nothing catastrophic. The kind of multi-year softness that you'd barely notice if you were still working. But because they were withdrawing, every dip meant selling more shares to cover the same expenses. Their portfolio wasn't just shrinking because of withdrawals. It was shrinking because the math had quietly turned against them. Their $1.4 million became $1.2 million, then $1.05 million. Within 5 years of retirement, they were watching a number they had spent 3 decades building descend faster than they ever expected. And they still had, potentially, 25 more years to fund. I want to be careful here. David and Linda didn't lose everything. They weren't destitute. They adjusted. They cut some expenses. They moved into a smaller place. Linda picked up some part-time work she actually enjoyed. But the retirement they had imagined, the one they had worked 32 years for, that retirement quietly slipped away. Not because of a catastrophe, because of a sequence of small, compounding miscalculations that none of their preparation had accounted for. And when Linda sat down one night and actually ran the numbers, when she looked at what they had, what they were spending, and what the projections said, she cried. Not out of panic. Out of grief, maybe. The kind of grief that comes when you realize the version of your future you spent decades holding on to looks different than you thought. That moment broke something open for me when I heard about it. Because these weren't careless people. These were exactly the people who followed the rules. And the rules, well, the rules didn't mention a few things. They didn't mention that the sequence of returns matters as much as the returns themselves. They didn't mention that taxes on traditional retirement accounts can quietly erode your withdrawal rate. They didn't mention that claiming Social Security early, while tempting, is a permanent reduction that compounds against you for decades. And maybe most importantly, the rules didn't mention that a financial plan you make at 35 needs to be actively revisited at 60, 62, and 64, not just trusted on autopilot. Here's the mindset shift I want to offer you. And it's subtle, but it matters. Most of us think about retirement planning as a savings problem. Save enough, and you're fine. But David and Linda's story shows that retirement is actually 2 completely different financial phases. The accumulation phase, saving, and the distribution phase, spending. And the rules that govern each phase are almost opposites of each other. In accumulation, consistency and time are your superpowers. In distribution, sequence and flexibility become everything. The people who retire well aren't just the ones who save the most. They're the ones who thought carefully about how they would withdraw, which accounts to pull from first, how to structure withdrawals to minimize taxes, whether to delay Social Security to maximize the guaranteed income, how much of their portfolio to keep in stable, lower volatility assets, what some call a cash buffer, so they don't have to sell equities at a loss during a bad market year. None of that is glamorous. None of it makes for exciting financial content. But it's the difference between the retirement you imagined and the one that quietly changes shape on you. If you're anywhere from your 40s to your 60s, here's what I'd actually encourage you to think about. First, start learning about which type of accounts you're saving in, traditional pre-tax versus Roth after tax. The mix matters enormously when you start withdrawing, because Roth distributions are tax-free, and having that flexibility can protect you in ways that are hard to see until you actually need them. Second, think about Social Security not as a reward you claim when you're tired of working, but as a lever. Delaying it, even a few years, can increase your monthly benefits significantly and permanently. It's essentially a guaranteed income stream, And the longer you wait within reason, the more powerful it becomes. Third, consider building what some people call a cash bucket or short-term reserves before you retire, enough to cover 1 to 3 years of expenses in something low risk. That way, if markets dip in your first few years of retirement, you're not forced to sell investments at a loss. You have time to let things recover. And finally, revisit your plan. Not once, regularly. The financial decisions that made sense at 45 need to be stress-tested at 60. Life changes. Tax laws change. Markets change. Your plan should change with them. David and Linda's story isn't a tragedy. It's a lesson. And the hardest thing about lessons like this is that they only become visible in hindsight, which is exactly why I wanted to share it with you now, before hindsight is the only option left. You're not behind. You're not broken. And the financial system is genuinely complicated in ways that aren't your fault. But awareness, just knowing that these dynamics exist, that sequence matters, that the distribution phase has its own rules, that awareness is worth more than almost any specific tactic. The goal isn't a perfect retirement. It's a resilient one. One where the small things don't compound into regret. One where you don't just cross the finish line. You actually know what to do once you're standing on the other side of it. Progress isn't just saving more. Sometimes it's understanding better. And now you do. If this made you think about your own retirement plan differently, share it with someone who's still in the saving phase. They need to hear this before they cross the finish line. And if you want to go deeper on building a retirement that actually holds, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is for.